I've been there, and I was like,
Calypso in here.
No.
wasn't the right time, but if I see her at the Capitol, legislative, sure.
It's already
But Sarah said she's
Reminder, everybody turn.
no, I just kind of wish I would have.
Is this the topic of the day, Tim?
What?
So this is it?
That's it?
Okay, we'll call this meeting to order. And I'd like to welcome Jay Squires, who's going to be presenting, and he represents Rupp, Anderson, Squires, and Walsh Berger. And he's going to give us information on land use decision-making that I'm sure we all can benefit from, and thanks Tim for arranging this. Unless Tim has some comments or anyone else, we'll get started.
I don't. Great to be here. I'm going to talk about today good processes and good decisions. We'll focus on land use because that's the reason for being here, but I think some of the things we'll talk about today you can carry over into other matters because the process to make good decisions is not unique to land use, and having good processes also is not unique to land use. And so the first part of the 2 hours we have, I'd like to talk about having good processes. And by that I mean processes that are open and transparent and allow for public participation, but yet aren't painful for us. I used to represent a city in the metro area where the mayor was on the far end of the scale of narcissism, and we would start meetings at 5 o'clock and we'd finish at 2 in the morning. And we'd go over and over and over, and everyone would about want to die at 2 in the morning, and decisions would be made just to be over, not because they were good decisions. So having good processes that allow for full public participation, but yet balance that with maintaining order and decorum and being comfortable and being able to go home at a reasonable time at night is, I think, important in the government arena. And then the second part of the 2 hours, I'd like to talk about decisions and, making good decisions. So in the land use arena, that means making decisions that are based on solid, defensible facts and that are tied back to the standards for the particular decision that you're making as well. So as for those of you who have attended things that I've given, presentations I've given, you know that we like dialogue, so please feel free to jump in, stop me mid-sentence and ask a question. Throw out an example that you've run into here in the county on the point I'm talking about, so that we can talk about how that fits in with the point I'm trying to make. So don't feel shy about that as well. I'm going to go through quickly some of the material and not touch on it too much. I start out with open meeting law, but this isn't an open meeting law presentation, but I think it's important to have an understanding of some of the parts of the open meeting law as they relate to land use decisions and be aware of what the law is. Because the open meeting law is a law, sometimes called the Sunshine Law, but it's a statute that applies to the county and to the planning county board, the planning commission, and it's really designed to assure that the public has a right to be able to observe the process of decision making in government. So we always have to be careful, even when we have land use matters, of understanding what the open meeting law is and how we can not avoid running afoul of it. So real quick, I'm going to just hit the open meeting law at a 10,000-foot level, but the open meeting law applies to the county board, it applies to the planning commission, and it says that when you have, generally the rule is when you have a quorum of the members of that body meeting together, that's a meeting. So you always have to be aware of that. Chance social gatherings, the fact that a quorum attends the same church on Sunday morning doesn't mean that you violated the open meeting law by going to church. Or you see a couple of your members in the restaurant and you show up and you have a quorum in the same restaurant, doesn't mean that you violated it. So chance social gatherings are not part And then training programs, like if you've attended training programs that I've done most recently, I think end of last fall in St. Cloud, you happen to have a quorum of your planning commission or your county board available, that doesn't violate the law. Now, if you sit together at lunch and you talk about an issue that you've got coming up on the next agenda, that presents a separate problem. But just being at the same training session and gathering information as an attendee on that is
Being
not a
at a
problem.
training session and going and having lunch. 3 people from the board.
That's fine, I mean, you can sit together at the same table and have lunch, but it changes from being a training session where you happen to have lunch to something else if you start discussing something on the agenda. So always be aware that you can go together to training sessions and gather information, like we give in the land use arena, but you should refrain from discussing matters of unique county business.
So we have some public that get confused about this a lot. I know I was walking into the courthouse one day and a citizen actually stopped me and told me that 2 commissioners were already in the building. So.
It's a little bit of a rigid construction of the open meeting law.
Yeah, but there are often topics that come up at our planning and zoning board that are of high interest to the county commissioners. And so we have a quorum of commissioners at a planning and zoning commission meeting once you take on that.
Yeah, usually we try to be conservative in that regard, so if anything that relates to county business is happening where we suspect there may be a quorum of county board members present, it's always best just to post that to be careful. So you post your notice, treat it as a special meeting, so 72 hours posted notice, and usually the notices say something like, this matter is happening at the planning commission. It's possible that a quorum of county board members may be present.
So Jay, following up on that, should we just go ahead and incorporate that as a standard provision in our standard public notices for the Planning Commission Board of Adjustment, and just have a little sentence in there for every one of our notices for our meetings to say,
Because we
it is
don't-
possible that we may have a quorum of the county board attending?
Because we
Do
don't
you
always
post those
know.
notices then, or is that just?
Yeah, in the paper, and
Do you post them on the bulletin board as if they were special meetings?
no.
Yeah, so the law says you can give the regular schedule of that body's meeting at the beginning of the year, and that's sufficient to meet the requirements of a notice of a meeting. Then you've got to, if you have a special meeting, you have to post it. So we can talk about it, but I want to make sure that we have it covered appropriately. I think just including in your planning commission notice, a notice there may be county board members here, without posting it like it's a special meeting probably isn't enough.
But maybe if we.
But there's a way to
beginning
figure it
of
out,
the year.
yeah. Yeah, if you think you want to be just covered that,
Yeah.
at any given meeting, you would have given a notice, if 3 show up, we can figure that out.
Okay.
Because I'm the commissioner appointed on the planning commission, and I have had commissioners text me saying how many other commissioners are in the room, just to be
Yeah.
careful to not have.
Yeah, there is a potential exposure there if you haven't given notice and a quorum of the county board shows up and, sits out and wants to observe. It's an important matter, highly contentious, especially if you have people that are onto that stuff and
Sitting
monitoring
outside
where you all
monitoring.
are. So, yeah, I think that's a good practice. The most common thing that comes up, though, with respect to issues of the open meeting law in all decision-making processes, including land use, are what the courts have come to call serial meetings. So you may not necessarily ever have a quorum of the, let's say, county board together at the same time or connected electronically or anything like that. But the courts say, but if there are facts to suggest that there were serial discussions made with the intent of avoiding the requirements of the open meeting law, then that can be a problem. So what I mean by that is, and I start out by saying, the courts recognize, and in fact even say it's appropriate and necessary for board members to be able to talk to each other outside the meeting. So it's not true that a county board member can never call another county board member and say, what do you think about this issue? This is important to me. I think you're wrong. I think you should change your mind. to lobby back and forth is kind of the essence of democracy. But that's distinguished from a serial meeting context, which is where a county board member A calls county board member B and says, how are you gonna vote on this variance request we have coming up next week? Oh, you know, I'm opposed to it, I'm gonna vote no, good, I'm gonna vote no too. Why don't you call county board member C and see if she also will vote no? Do you see how a decision is being made outside that public arena, outside the fishbowl that we're supposed to live in, so the public has a chance to be able to see?
Jay, you're saying county board, but you're also including planning commission board of adjustment.
Yeah,
That's-
planning commission is subject, as I mentioned earlier, is subject to the open meeting law as well, so all these things, I'm just using board as an example. So any board or commission member doing that is a problem. So we also have to be in assuring good processes and not exposing the county and yourselves to open meeting law issues, because if you're found to have violated the open meeting law, you get hit with a big fine that the county can't pay for you. You have to pay for it yourself. So it's important for your own personal safety as well, that you assure that you stay out of that type of a discussion. So that's the one that comes up, I think, most often in terms of decision-making on land use, that we have to stay away from what are called serial meetings.
So the serial meeting trigger is when you say, will you contact so-and-so?
Well,
Do you
yeah,
leave
yeah.
it at contacting another commissioner for their thoughts, or is that?
Yeah, you can see there's a huge range of, there's a huge gray area and a range of nuances. There's no case that says you have to use the phrase, will you contact someone else? What the courts say is, if there are serial discussions with the intent of avoiding the requirements of the open meeting law. So there are no magic words, but if it's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, if I just get phone records, let's say I'm county board member A, I call you and ask you how you're gonna vote on it, then your phone records that you've been sued and you're subpoenaed and you provide them show that you immediately made 2 calls to 2 other county board members. That on its face looks like kind of a bad fact, doesn't it? What was going on? Then I'm gonna depose the county board members and find out what the discussion was.
You
That gets to
contact
be-
one, that's my question.
Well, then you have 3 linked, don't you? A, B, and C. So in your scenario, A called B, now B calls C. Or A calls C, is that your example?
No, it's just A to B and nothing.
Oh,
else.
yes, yeah, that's the point I made earlier. Again,
Good.
the
Okay,
courts
so I'll
say,
clarify that.
yep, it's the essence of democracy for you to be able to talk to other boards.
But
It's
as
just
soon as
when
you
there's
trigger
intent, yeah.
To go
When,
beyond.
yeah, as soon
interaction.
as you link 3 or more for a county board, that's a quorum. Then you start getting into potential exposure of someone saying, they made this
I want
decision
to
in
make sure they
advance.
understood that.
Yeah, you
Well,
bet.
it gets complicated because A calls B and then C calls B. C had no idea that A talked to B.
And that's a good fact then, isn't it? That goes to the intent, yeah. Yeah, so, you can see this is a very muddy area, but if you have people that are watching you, and if you have people that are willing to take you to task and sue you and make your life miserable, then you have to be really aware of this.
You have to be aware of that, it makes it almost impossible. Because
Yeah.
we're hypersensitive and we
Yeah.
think that we might be doing something wrong when we're not. So
Yeah.
thank you for.
So that's kind of the nutshell, real high-level open meeting law. Then I want to just talk about kind of moving into the right of the public to be, this is a little bit backwards, so open meeting law is the right of the public to be able to view the decision-making process, but also in terms of good processes, the public has to be aware that there is a process that exists. And that's really more of a staff issue, but I wanted to cover those anyways, because the public in the land use arena, there are requirements in state law and in your ordinance of notifying the public that there is a process that's going to occur, so then they can exercise their right to be able to observe its decision-making process and then also participate, which we'll talk about in a minute. So there are notice requirements in the land use area whenever the board adopts or amends ordinances. We have to give notices and have to have a public hearing. And also with respect to individual land use requests, as you're probably aware, we have to give special notices as well to people in the surrounding area because that may uniquely affect them, not just a notice in the paper that people rarely read, but an actual letter saying this permit or this CUP request or this variance request is coming before the board. So those people are kind of determined by the legislature to be in that zone of potential concern, and we have to make sure that they get individual notices so they're aware that that process ensues. Another kind of technical thing I wanted to cover, moving to page 6, and I'm going to skip over a few things. Just a little thing to be aware of in terms of the open meeting law and statutory requirements for the process is that materials that are made available to board and commission members have to be available to the public as well. So you've got your packet that's available. I don't know what your practice is. We have a public packet sitting out there that someone can look at if they wanted to. How often have you been making a land use decision where papers are flying all around? An applicant comes in and has copies, he wants, here's a new plan, I need some revisions, I'd like you to take a look at it. Technically, everything that board and commission members get in the process, including at meetings, has to be available to the public. So oftentimes we forget that if, for example, the land use office sends out, oh, here's another document I just got in today for the meeting tonight, that we have to have a process to assure that every single piece of paper that you get as board and commission members is also available to the public. So there should be a good practice and procedure for supplementing that agenda packet that went out and is set there with the things that just came out that day because they were received by the land use office that day. Everything that's handed out to the board and commission members, there should be an extra copy to go back in there for people to look at as well. So that's an oft violated provision of the law.
Question a little bit the appropriateness of the amounts of material that are brought to a meeting. We haven't for a while had a big packet, but there's been times when, yeah, you get a packet like this when you come in the room. That's just making any decision then, you really can't digest what's in there at all. So you know you can't. So once you accepted it, you took it, and then you didn't use it. It just seems like sometimes just accepting the information into the record creates a problem. Or could create a problem.
Yeah, it's difficult. Let's say sometimes you see applicants who come in with a bunch of new stuff that you've never seen before to the meeting. Sometimes you have residents who come in with a big stack of papers at the public hearing and say, here, here's a bunch of stuff for you to look at when you make your decision in 15 minutes. Things like that. It's difficult for us to say, no, we're not going to take those. In contrast, if you've ever been involved in environmental review, there's a process where there's a formal public comment period that's closed and things like that. So certainly I have had clients have actual written rules that say written materials have to be submitted X, but invariably not everyone complies with that. So then your decision is, do we then just say, sorry, throw them in the garbage, we're not going to look at them? Or what other options do we have?
And we did in our ordinance make that
Yeah,
change.
you made the change.
Yeah.
But they still sneak in.
But they do.
You like it in their way.
You try to discourage it as best you
I
can.
understand how it's hard to say no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But realistically, and oftentimes it's a letter from Sally that said,
Yeah.
don't let them do that. But sometimes when it's a bunch of information, if you don't digest it and you make a decision, how do you haven't incorporated it.
Yeah, aside from throwing it away, what other options do you have?
Could you,
Well, Don is the chair, and he's really good about letting the public know that we don't have the time to incorporate that into this, that we'll look at what we can, and it gives us time to read it. You stop the meeting and give us like 3 minutes to read it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just can't. It
So,
doesn't-
The
yeah.
other option is postpone it to the next
Well,
meeting.
that's it.
Yep.
And I think we're getting to the reason they gave you the big packages.
Yeah, and do you have enough, as you know, there's
I
a
like this process.
timeline in statute for making decisions, a 60-day rule. Do you have enough time within that? That's always a consideration. So you have to, if you're gonna table it or postpone it, you have to make sure that you're doing that appropriately.
Yeah.
I guess, I know in certain situations in my past anyway, sometimes you actually, the chair says this will become part of the record. And then it does, or if you don't, we'll just accept this information and act on it later. Is there anything that can be done in that regard?
Well, I think to the extent that people give us a big stack of paper, it does become part of the record.
It does,
Yeah, we just
okay.
can't say, we'll take it, but we're not gonna make it part of the record. It is part of the record. So, I think the best practice is to have rules to discourage that, so that you minimize the likelihood it's gonna happen. It does happen, then you have to decide how are we gonna handle this. Is it a small enough stack that we, and an important enough issue, maybe we don't have any more time under the 60-day rule, that we say, well, we're gonna just have to take some time and have the commissioners be able to look at this. Probably a better scenario for it to be at the planning commission, because you're advisory, so, you know, there's time for the board members to be able to look at that before they get it, but, you know, if you've got time, postponing it, tabling it is sometimes the best option if it's a lot of stuff.
When does the 60 days start? Is it meeting, is it the?
Upon submittal of a complete application containing all of the information and materials required by your county ordinance.
This is considered a public hearing at the planning commission.
That's where
Right.
public hearings are
So
held.
if you refuse to take information, I don't think that would, you could
Yeah, I-
eliminate, you know, you could discriminate by not accepting information, so I think you have to take it all.
Yeah, I have not had the case yet. I have had the case in environmental review where there's a specific environmental quality board rule that says, here's the public comment period. It closes, written materials must be submitted. And I have successfully defended a county that then, when someone came in and after the fact and just submitted a whole stack of papers, they said, sorry, you missed the comment period, garbage. And they sued and we were successful there. But that was a specific EQB rule. I haven't yet had the case where a county has a deadline for submitting materials where we've been bold enough to say, oh, sorry, it's garbage.
Well,
We have the deadline.
But I think that's, so yes, I think that's not the preferred approach.
The reason I asked about when it starts is like hypothetically, a February 1st deadline for March 14th meeting wouldn't allow us to postpone to another meeting.
Well, keep in mind,
Well-
you have the ability to extend unilaterally for any reason for 60. So the 60-day rule is really a 120-day
Yeah.
The
rule.
applicant agrees.
So we usually have enough elbow room, and the applicant can waive it. So if it's the applicant coming in saying, here's a whole bunch of new stuff, you say, well, you're gonna have to waive the 60-day rule then, so we can look at that.
That one's a little easier than
Yeah.
somebody who says, I
Yeah.
don't want that crap going on in my neighborhood, and they try to dump it.
yeah. And in the past, the reason why we
Technical terms, I
pursued the change in the ordinances, in the past, we have had people come in opposition to a particular case and have a bunch of information they wanted to submit in the specific intent to postpone it or derail it in some fashion. We're fortunate in the fact that since we put that deadline into effect, we haven't had those occurrences, but we have had the little letter from Sally.
And my next thought was, I think staff's doing a good job of filtering that, because we used to see some, you put the notice in and now you get a letter or something, and it's no big deal.
Does the applicant have to agree to the additional 60, or is that?
No, there's two different timeframes. The first, we have 60 days, we can unilaterally extend that another 60 days for simply just because we even need just more time. We just have to state the reason and give them notice of that we're extending it. So in essence, in some cases, I call it the 120-day rule, because we have that time. We just have to make sure that we provide them written notice that we're extending it. If we can also extend it as Jay's indicating, even beyond that, if we have written consent from the applicant to go ahead and extend it. Sometimes they're having trouble collecting their information, and instead of just up and denying their request, they go ahead and sign a waiver saying, okay, well, we're just gonna go ahead and extend it indefinitely.
Very good.
I was just under the impression if there was anything submitted at or just before the meeting that it would become, I'm curious about the timing of things as far as it would be in the minutes, and then that's how it's public. Are you saying that it needs to be available for anyone in the audience right then and there?
Yeah, technically, everything that a board or commission member gets up on the dais as part of the process, whether it be in your packet you get in the mail, or supplements from anyone else, or people coming to the meeting that night, there should be a copy available for the public.
And sometimes what happens is somebody will come in with one sheet to hand out, they don't even have copies for everybody, and Diana will go run and burn up a bunch of copies and do it and have an extra one or two, just in that case. But sometimes we've had the planning commission members read it and pass it down the line, while we're getting copies made.
It's a joke.
Yeah.
It's really kind of a joke when that happens, you know.
Yeah.
Here's
It
what they
makes
asked
the
for.
process more difficult.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought it was good to talk about it, to just talk about options of how we handle this and manage documents, to have a process in place as best we can.
Would it be appropriate, or, I mean, what are the limits here? Can we just have our TV? Can we have a scanner, or someone comes with a letter, you scan it and put it on the TV, now the whole audience can see it? Does that cover it? Or, now say there's a
Yeah,
pack, can you
yeah.
scan that and have it just online for anyone to access? Or, I mean, I see some,
It's probably one of those cases where the statute's not caught up with technology.
Sure,
So
yeah.
the statute, the way it's written, still says that it has to be available, I think, in
Oh.
manual form.
okay.
So I think for us to just say, well, we flashed it up on the screen probably isn't enough, so I think you still need to run back and.
Well, and I just want to be clear too, we have had cases where people have come in either just before the meeting or a day or two before, but it's past that deadline with the bigger packet, and we've declined to take it. We've said, we apologize, we can't, the deadline for it, we show them the provision in the ordinance. It doesn't happen a lot, but it has happened, and they've respected that.
They haven't sued us
Yeah,
yet.
yeah, you haven't, and that's the case that I haven't defended yet,
Yeah.
but, I mean, if someone's really ticked off enough to pursue that claim, I still think we've got good arguments, but it's not a clear winner.
They show it.
So we have to make decisions about how we handle
We'll
it.
be originally take it at the meeting.
Yeah.
So if I'm writing notes during the meeting, are those public record?
I would say they're not necessarily part of the record for purposes of the lawsuit, but there's a different issue about whether they're public data, if someone made a data request for them, whether they'd have access to them. I can't say I can think of a reason that they wouldn't be public data, because the Data Practices Act says all data is public unless it's classified as private by a particular provision in the Act.
So if I take my note and hand it to Craig, who sits next to me, does it then become?
I think the fact you reduce it to tangible physical form, even if you don't hand it to anyone, still means that it's data.
Okay. And now our board uses computers during the meeting, the county board, some of us. If we receive a text during the meeting that comes up on our screen about something we're talking about, is that also public?
Chorus, there's a particular provision in the Data Practices Act that says correspondence between public officials and constituents can be made public by either the constituent or the public official. So if whoever sent it to you says, no, I don't want to make that public, and you say, no, I don't want to make that public, then that may be one example of where it'd be private. But that, again, is different from your notes. That's not correspondence between constituents.
If the county board were texting amongst themselves.
Or the
Yeah,
planning
that's a
commission
problem.
Well, I can see it happening.
Yeah.
Well, no.
Do you have an electronic
They're kind of
communication
scheme-wide.
policy? Do you know, that applies to the board and commission members?
Not that applies to the board.
Yeah, we have one, but it's not that.
It's not uncommon for municipalities to have electronic communication policies, and one of the provisions frequently is when you're up at the dais, you shouldn't be messing with the googly stuff. Because even if you're not doing that, members of the public get the impression that you're doing that, and that's just kind of a bad PR thing. So you might want to look at that. But yeah, certainly, going back to our serial meeting discussion, you're communicating with other board members up there about a particular issue, and you see you're outside the fishbowl, that's a problem for us, so we shouldn't do that. Last thing I want to talk about, just in land use, talking, again, as long as we're on data practices issue, that we always want to, there are larger issues in other areas where we may want to or need to discuss data that's classified as private under the Data Practices Act, but yet we're in this public arena. No committee law says we have to be in a public arena, but the Data Practices Act says, oh, this data is private. It's a bigger issue in other areas, but the only thing in the land use area to keep in mind is principally the only bit of public data that you'll run into in land use decisions, from my experience, is the identity of a complainant about the use of property. So neighbor X is the one that turned in neighbor Y for violating the ordinance and called a county board member, and then you're going through an after the fact area and say, well, county board member should not say, oh, it was Joe that called me and told me about this problem. That's private data. So always be cognizant that whoever complains about the use of property in violation of ordinances, their identity is private. So you should never disclose that to others or at a public meeting as well. I just wanted to, in terms of good processes, I wanted to throw that last nugget on, that that's one element of the Data Practices Act we have to be careful about. Then I'm going to go on to page 7. So those are high-level statutes to be aware of in terms of regulating our process and what we have to be knowledgeable about. Then I want to kind of move into how do we control members of the public in hearings and at meetings in a way that makes them as comfortable as possible. Because we don't want to be in meetings when we're just making decisions because we're so darn tired we want to get home and go to bed. I often share a story when before I got married the first time I met my wife's grandmother. She was a good old German, and she pulled me aside before she'd ever said anything to me, and she pulled me aside and said to me, Jay, I want you to know everything that happens after midnight is the devil's work. I don't want you to get yourself into. And then I started representing municipalities, and I realized it's true. It's when you attend these meetings, and when they go on, and you get beaten up by the public, and it's after midnight, you just make terrible decisions. So one of the ways to manage that is to control their participation and address bad behavior, but also set out expectations, because I found that members of the public, well, most members of the public, if they understand how the process works, if they're advised of that, then they'll generally follow it. But think of if they don't know how the process works. You've got a big contentious issue, someone's never been before the county board, they don't know how it works. Well, how can you fault them for not following your rules if they don't know what your rules are? So I think it's incumbent on us to be able to create an environment that allows them an opportunity to follow rules. So we do have a right to make rules that govern hearings and govern our processes. We can control our own meetings. We're the ones that are in charge of the agenda. We have, and I'll talk a little bit more about controlling each other and try to be respectful about that, but we have the ability to use parliamentary procedure and to be able to adopt reasonable rules that govern their conduct that make meetings less painful, or at least as painless as possible. Start on page 7 a little bit, just kind of laying some background about how we control the public. Now, public hearings are a different thing because people have a right to participate in a public hearing. So you have a variance request, notice goes out, the neighbor comes in and wants to be able to offer his or her piece. If we say, no, sorry, you can't talk, we have a problem. We don't let people participate in public hearings. But you have a public comment period at every board meeting. Did you know you didn't have to have that?
Right.
There's nothing in state law that requires that. So you can certainly, absent a public hearing, never allow the public to participate in stuff, and that's okay. They don't have a right to be able to comment. But when we when we have a public comment period, what the law says is that we have created a limited public forum for the exercise of speech. So we've created a forum where people now have a right to be able to say pretty much anything they want. The first principal cardinal rule is we cannot regulate, once we've created a limited public forum, we cannot restrain or regulate speech on the basis of content. So if someone gets up and we don't like what they say, we can't say we aren't going to hear anyone who says that. You see how we're making distinctions based on content? Or we've got this county project, we'll allow anyone to speak that supports the project, but if you don't, you can't speak. That's a particular problem. So we're distinguishing based on content, and we can't do that.
And the board chair do that with committee members, with other board members, if there's a discussion going on and the chair feels that the discussion is going away from the topic?
Well, certainly the chair has the ability to keep the focus of the meeting on a particular topic. But if your question is, can the board make distinctions in content of speech by allowing only board members, using my example, only board members that want to talk who support this project can talk, I won't let anyone else talk, that'd be a problem too, for the same reasons.
Can the board chair or whatever have some authority to regulate how it's delivered? Like if they get up and start shaking their fist in your face,
Yep.
then you would be able to.
Yep, hold that thought. I'm going to talk about that in more detail when we talk about how we manage difficult client and difficult public meetings.
When you're having such a meeting, or when you have a lot of people spoken, it seems like it's okay to say, you know, we don't have to repeat ourselves over and over. If you agree with what Bob said, say so.
Yep, turn to page 8 and we'll talk about that.
Okay.
So you can't regulate on the basis of content when you've created a limited forum. So a public comment period, or certainly a public hearing, people have a right to be able to speak. We can't say only people with this view can speak. But how can we control then how that process works and how it looks? Through what courts call time, place, and manner regulations. So we can't control what's said, but we have the ability to control to some degree how it's said through time, place, and manner restrictions. And these are the tools that you can use to make your process orderly, to get yourself out by 11 o'clock at night instead of sometime after midnight. And again, going back to my example, I call the trained pig example, most of the people, if you say, here's how it will work, my gosh, they follow that process because now they understand. Recognizing that there's always the person who will never follow any rules, so you just have to accept that and move on. But you try to capture as many as you can with your requirements. But one of them, the first one to control the process, is to require signing cards. To require some sort of a formal process that people understand, if you want to participate in this process, you have to do this. And that to some extent avoids, have you ever been at a meeting where a chair has lost control and it turns into something like a town hall? Has anyone ever been to a town hall meeting where people are getting up from the audience or talking over each other, doing things like that? When you lose control, then it becomes something like a town hall meeting. So saying, if you wish to speak, If you wish to say anything, address the board. You can't just call out from your seat and say something. You have to sign a card. You have to come up to the podium. I was on the planning commission in the Twin Cities where we used the cards, and it really created an orderly process. Then I, as chair, had the cards, and I'd call people up. Joe Johnson, and Joe would stand up and he'd walk up to the podium. People are given structure and they just start to follow it. So, I mean, that's a good thing to follow. Some people or some municipalities have sign-in sheets. Do you ever use a sign-in sheet? Same thing as a card. The chair has something to read and create that order that people crave in the processes. Then time limits is another thing. You give people time limits. Do you have a time limit at all?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, you're generous. 3 is okay. I've actually had a court decision where 3 was okay. 3 is probably the most common. 5 is common as well.
We don't state that planning or board of adjustment, we don't state any time limit, never have. Never had to really. Tell people, please move it along. So without having such a rule in place.
But this is pertaining to public comment.
Right.
Yes, it is.
During the hearing, I'm talking
Yeah.
about, yeah, during the hearing.
You
I'm talking about, like, yeah, I'm jumping to a hearing.
Yeah, well, usually it's in conjunction with a public comment period at a meeting. It's less common for someone to have a time limit at a public hearing, but in my judgment, you certainly can do that as well. If you've never had problems with it, then sometimes you say, why fix it if we've been able to manage it, but I think you can have that.
Well, and I think we've had the board chairs at the planning commission board of adjustment kind of ask how many people want to speak, or if there's enough people, we might have to limit the time, kind of make that
Yeah.
statement,
As
but
we go,
we've not
it
had
could
to do
happen, you
it.
know, yeah. So
Case by
everybody be respectful of the others, and we'll move this along, and it seems to happen.
But
Yeah.
the important thing is they all have the same amount of time.
Right, well, but that's my point, we don't typically do that, so then kind of in the middle of the process, we may say, hey, folks, you can't have 30-minute speech, we gotta move this along, and we could make a change in the middle of our process.
Sure, and also related to that too, the importance of there being the same amount of time enforcing it equally too is important, because what do you think happens if you say everybody's got 3 minutes and the first person goes 8 minutes? What's the second person gonna think they have? 8 minutes. So if you don't enforce your time limits, then that's a problem as well. And then you occasionally get, when you have large groups, it's a contentious issue. Have you ever had people want to donate time to other people? You could actually, if you don't have it already, put an anti-donation provision in your rules of procedure. That actually, this was a court decision upheld an anti-donation rule. This was in, I don't know if you follow, but Stillwater in the Twin Cities had a big school closing issue a number of years ago. It was highly contentious. They had an anti-donation rule. They rigidly enforced it, and that was challenged, and the court upheld it. So we actually know from a court decision we can have an anti-donation rule. So that's a good one, because I hate it too. I'm going to give all my time so this person can stand up for an hour and a half and talk.
Okay, so during public comment period, which we have for a board county board meetings, I assume you have too. Someone is talking and then a commissioner starts interacting with that person because they don't agree with them. Where do you go with that?
Yeah, well, it's really a matter of how you want to approach it. The most common practice that I've seen for bodies that I think is the most efficient is that the public comment period is intended to be one way. That it's intended for citizens to offer information to the board that then, if it requires further evaluation or discussion, will occur at another meeting. Then you would avoid that. So that's the most common practice, and I think that works pretty well.
We have citizens come to public comment that have a list of questions. So we have had a board chair that is very rigid with the time and has a clock, and so they stop the clock to answer the question, so that the citizen still gets their full 2, 3, or 5 minutes. But the board currently doesn't answer questions, they just let them ask them.
Well, I don't think there's any right or wrong way, just from my experience, and I'm probably more in the practical than the legal arena, but if you do use a public comment period to encourage or allow citizens to ask questions and then you answer questions, I would just wonder, is that the most efficient way to use a public comment period? But that's the county board's call. I'm not gonna tell you that there's a legal problem with that, but just I don't, from my experiences, and I've attended more meetings than I ever hoped I would attend in my life, or wished maybe. But I just don't know that that is the greatest thing for a public comment period.
It's
You
not
prolong
a lot.
meetings.
Yeah.
And it's not oftentimes very efficient to try to answer questions off the cuff. It's most often that we need to send this back to staff and
Yeah.
have them look at it, and then we can, maybe staff online will contact you and give you the information or whatever, to dispatch with it quickly at your level.
One thing we've done is at the end, toward the end of our board meeting, if someone says, Mrs. Jones had a question and would like to address it, we've also done it at the end of our meeting. Usually Mrs. Jones is already gone, so she doesn't hear the answer, that's the problem.
Yeah.
One way that we've tried to have the public understand that we hear them, and we will try to address.
Mhm. Yeah, I recognize there's a whole layer of public accountability here that you want constituents to feel that they have the ability to be able to get answers. But again, this is all a balance. It's a balance of the scales. It's a balance of the public's right to participate and be part of government, and your right to be able to sit where you do and not be uncomfortable or burdened too much.
It's really uncomfortable when you can't answer some questions.
That's why you try to get time, you refer it to staff. So time limits, relevancy and germane requirements. People come in and, let's say it's a public hearing on a variance issue, and you've got someone who's been ticked off at the county for years, and they use it as a vehicle to start bitching about all kinds of other stuff that has nothing to do with the application at hand. We have the ability to control that. We're gonna, in just a second here, we're gonna talk about one county's journey in that regard.
So we shouldn't respond to that.
Pardon me?
We shouldn't respond. I mean, I choose not to respond when I hear comments like,
Yeah.
you were born in Cook County.
That's
I
right,
mean,
yeah.
get off topic.
Yeah.
Thanks.
When,
I know about it.
yeah, I just kind of keep my mouth shut, but.
Yeah.
That did actually happen at.
Yeah, just recently.
Yeah.
The whole
Yeah,
board
that's-
said, oh, you
Yeah, that's
were.
where the chair, that's
We
where
should
the
be
chair
approved because we've
comes
been
into
here for
play.
5 generations.
Yeah.
Being disruptive, inappropriate comments, that's probably a good example of them, are things that we can handle. Sanctions, people, when we give them the rules, we should also let them know what's gonna happen if they don't follow the rules, right? Just like your kids, it's good for them to know, I hear the rules and you're gonna be grounded if you don't follow the rules. So
What
having
does
sanctions.
being grounded mean? Because
Pardon
what does being grounded mean? Because we have a hard time when someone doesn't follow the rules. We don't want to beat the parent and go, now you're
Yeah.
grounded, or kick them out of the room. Like, how do you handle
We'll
that?
get to that in a second.
Okay.
And then, another time, place, and manner restriction is providing alternative avenues of communication, like letters, like giving written materials instead of standing up in front of you and talking for an hour. You can read written materials that they provide to you, so encouraging the fact that they submit materials. So now I want to take those things and I want to tell you a story about a southern Minnesota county. This is a true story. And it's a story about, and you probably have had, if you don't have right now, you probably have had over the years that gadfly resident or residents who comes to every county board meeting and complains about everything and makes the meetings much worse than they would be absent their presence. And this was a county that had one. And this guy was over the top, was rude, was offensive, was just not pleasant to be in a room with him, and he was at every county board meeting, making every county board member's lives miserable. So they adopted a rule of procedure and ultimately banned him for life from attending any county board meetings. How do you think that would fly in
You
the
gotta call the court.
Do you have like a
They called
banned
me up,
list
I
on the
said,
door?
yeah, that's right, called me up, I said, I think that might be a problem. And the next call I got was from the Civil Liberties Union, who was representing the guy, about that ban, questioning whether it would withstand judicial scrutiny. I was doubtful myself. So we ended up actually taking a step back and kind of thinking through, okay, we have this terrible person, so how do we adopt rules of procedure for the board that will withstand constitutional scrutiny in our judgment, but yet allow us to do something about this person? So that's what this is. I call it Rule 19 because that's what they call it. As you can tell, they had at least 18 rules, procedural rules. This was 19 that we added to the end. That was intended to deal with this. So turning to page 9, item number 3 is really all these things I've been talking about how you control the process and control citizens' participation. It gives them the participation right, but yet makes your life okay as well. So just kind of going through 3, you can see all of these things that we talked about as vehicles to control the process. 3A and 3B, a sign-up sheet. Someone has to be recognized as up in line for them to be able to speak after they sign. A time limit. This county had 5 minutes like you do as well under D. A requirement of germaneness, so we actually had a rule that established a rule that said you can't just go off starting to talk about something that's not relevant to anything at hand. No demonstrations as well. You ever had a big contentious meeting where people hold up signs as well? You know, things like that, where you have demonstrations. Something in the form of demonstrations they had as well. This guy would occasionally bring signs that were offensive too. Then in E, kind of the prohibited conduct that is offensive when you see it happening. Engaging individual board members, this is kind of one we talked about a little bit earlier. When someone is up there during like a public comment period, again, it's a one-way street. So it's not, in this county, it's not a dialogue. It's not a right for someone to get up and start asking individual members questions. It's their opportunity to just talk and just say, thank you very much, we appreciate it, we'll refer that to staff or whatever. Insults, obscenity, profanity, attacks, physical violence, things like that. All of the prohibited types of conduct as well. So that kind of G is all the bad stuff, bad behavior that people can engage in. Then H are the H, I, and J are the consequences as well. So what do we do if someone has violated all these standards of conduct that we've adopted as well? And it sets out the process for handling that ultimately can result under I at the end of I in a law enforcement officer coming escorting that person out. But that's after a series of warnings of notice that you're violating these rules, and this is what's going to happen to you if you keep doing it. So we ended up, and this was kind of a dialogue back and forth, and the Civil Liberties Union said, yeah, we think that rule's okay, we're not going to pursue it. So I can't say this is withstood judicial scrutiny, but I can say that the Civil Liberties Union people, at least at the time, said that they were comfortable with a procedural rule like this for a board meeting. So this is something that actually was the result, comes out of the real world, and a county down in southern Minnesota adopted as a result of a real problem and involved engagement with those people that are the greatest defenders of constitutional rights in the state. So I'd like to think we'd have a good chance.
So is this out for the public at every meeting, or does the chair start the meeting by reading these rules?
Yeah, what I have found, and it varies widely, but so I have some clients who actually read it as a matter of practice at every meeting. If you have a meeting where things just aren't contentious, you have no one in the audience, it doesn't make sense to do that, waste time. But certainly at those meetings where it's highly contentious, a good practice is to splash this up on the screen and go over the rules. For the reasons I talked about earlier, they have to know what the rules are, and they have to know what the consequences are as well. So if you have a procedural rule like this, if you put it right up on the screen and at least you summarize.
Because we have had audience members specifically ask specific members of the boards to answer their questions.
Does this apply to public hearings and like truth and taxation?
You can use it for, this county used it for everything. This was part of their general rule of procedure because it was intended to deal with a guy who was at every meeting and would be disruptive and outrageous on every issue that they talked about.
Could you, I agree with your comment that not to use it unless you have to, but let's say it just gets very unruly and then all of a sudden the board chair or whoever it is that's facilitating, we're going to call a meeting to order to review our expectations rather than to start everyone with the assumption that that's going to happen.
Yeah, let's say, for
You could just go,
example.
is that point of order or is it point of
Yeah.
Robert rules or something?
Yeah,
Point
here's,
of privilege.
sure, yeah. Here's one way I would handle it. So this in my opinion would be a good practice. So if it's a meeting where you think you need to remind everybody of the rules, you handle that at the front end anyways. But let's say it's a meeting where you didn't go through that because you didn't expect anything and all of a sudden Katie barred the door, when an agenda item comes up, you get stormed by the public and they come in and things get outrageous and you just weren't aware of that. Maybe the best practice is to, or maybe it was a crowd that wasn't unruly, but became unruly, and you didn't bother to read the rules beforehand. You can always take a break in your meeting. So take a break. Sometimes the break allows people to cool off too, doesn't it, a little bit? So you take a break, and then you come back and you say, just to assure that we have some order in the rest of this meeting, I'm going to read the rule of procedure that applies here, so everybody knows how this is supposed to work.
Is that called a point of order, or you don't have to?
You don't have to do that if you've taken
You just
a little
do the break.
yeah, and the chair can just say, we've got this rule I wanted to cover for members of the audience because it looks like a lot of you are very interested in this issue and we want to be sure that you follow the procedures. And one little line that always worked great for me when I was a chair that I share with people, for you chairs or chair wannabes, when you have the person who's really disruptive and being a pain in the butt, and I'll pick you. I just say to you, you're taking up a lot of time here, and you're going over the same thing about 5 times, and you're being disruptive. I want to be sure that all your friends and neighbors also have a chance to be able to address the board, and you're depriving them of that opportunity. So finish your comments, so that your neighbors can come up and also offer their concerns so we can take them into consideration.
Well, if you
You
just
see
answer
what
the
I've
questions,
done?
it'll move
You don't
on.
give a crap about me,
No, I don't.
but you give a crap about your friends and neighbors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a line you can use as well, to maybe encourage the end of someone's participation too. And then they feel bad, like, oh my God.
Your friends and neighbors agree with them, so they want them to keep talking and
That's
keep down
fine.
their 5 minutes.
Yeah. Then at least we'll get maybe a more reasonable friend or neighbor that comes up and argues as well, and if the same thing happens, you do the same thing to that person.
I think about, when you talk about meetings and problems, I think about watching meetings here. A few years back, I think was it a tax issue, whatever the issue was, it doesn't matter. It was, and the more they were told, if you have any more outbreaks, this is gonna end. No, they ain't gonna end. They weren't gonna cancel the meeting. So, the threat was there, but and involved, more times you said it and didn't do it, the worse it got.
Well, and the
Say
chair-
anything you can enforce.
Yeah, the chair would say, remember to be respectful, and then they started chanting that back at the board. Be respectful, be respectful.
You don't respect us, why should we respect you?
It was a lynching.
Without the deputy there ready to take somebody out.
There was one in the back of the.
It has improved.
Yeah.
It has
Yeah,
improved.
yeah. We
A
don't
point
have any of
of
these issues.
clarification, under A, when they sign in, that they give the topic they're going to speak.
You can do that too, yeah.
We have them sign in when they come up to the microphone, but it's Katie bar the door in terms of what they're gonna talk about.
Mhm.
Is that important? That they stick to, they say, this is my topic, or a little more flexibility on that?
I think by you requiring them to identify their topic, it encourages them to stay on topic.
It was mentioned that we have just people come up, raise their hand and come up, but I know a lot of boards have just a sign-in sheet and they come up in that order. What do you recommend?
I think a sign-up sheet's better because it creates a more
Sure.
formal process. Once you start engaging, they raise their hands, and it becomes more of an interactive process, which is what you want to try to
We should
avoid.
put it in our announcements for board meetings that if you have public comment, you need to sign in at the door. We'll have a sheet.
And usually the
Like
chair,
bylaws.
yeah, the chair will, as a first order of business, will remind people of that.
Okay.
Yep. If you're just getting in or you haven't noticed, if you want to talk at public comment period, you have to sign up the sheet. So the sheet, there it is. Put your name and what you're going to talk about. And just a reminder, and then you launch into your agenda.
But it seems to me at the board meetings, the Board of Commissioners meetings, that you might have some people that say, well, I have 2 items I wanna speak about. But it's the public hearings with the Planning Commission and Board of Adjustment where they really need to stay focused on it. And they don't drift really off topic as much as they do make it start personal attacks or something like that where they have to be reeled in. But are you saying that even with just a generalized public comment period at the Board of Adjustment or Board of Commissioners, that it should be limited to just one topic? Or what if someone comes up and says, I got 3 things I want to talk about?
Yeah, I think that, they can list 3 things, but I think you enforce your time limit. Then they better do a minute and 2/3 or whatever on each one, or however they want to portion it. But at least you get them out there and limit them to what they put on the sheets. Bottom of page 11, we've talked about some of this stuff already, so kind of touching again on how to deal with large crowds. Advise them on rules, I've already talked about that. Encouraging written comments, I already talked about that. Reminding them, I think someone maybe made the comment earlier, if someone's giving you a 5-page letter, there's nothing worse than when they stand at the podium and read their 5-page letter word for word. You're saying to yourself, you're wasting my time. So encourage them that if they have submitted written materials that they don't have to read them, they can just say, I've submitted the letter, and we would have received those and reviewed those materials as well. So encouraging the written materials. Cross-examination, we've talked about that. When members of the public, let's say that the permit applicant, the developer is up there giving the presentation, the members of the public start asking the developer questions and whatnot. You see where that's, you are the ones that are maintaining control of the meeting. You've lost it when you let residents start engaging in dialogue with the applicant. So that's a point where you remind them, no, that's not how it works here. You're not asking questions of the developer. You have a chance to participate. You can address us as a board, but you don't have that right to ask them questions. Then finally, it's so common when people are concerned about an application that they get up and they think that all they have to tell you is they oppose it, isn't it? But does that matter? In the eyes of the court, it makes no difference, because the courts say neighborhood opposition is not a reason to deny any permit. So you can have everybody in the county opposed to it, but that doesn't matter. But why they're opposed to it certainly matters. So it's also important for us as board and commission members that when we have the large crowds and they get up and they want to participate and speak, that we draw out from them the facts that are important to us as decision makers. So that is, why are you opposed? So you're opposed to that. Why are you opposed? We need to know why. Is it because of traffic issues that result from this development? Is it an impact on your property? If it is, what are the impacts, and why do you know that there are impacts, and what are your concerns, et cetera, et cetera. So the reasons that there are when we have large crowds are important, for reasons I'll talk about in a moment.
Can you go back to 3, because at county board meetings, we do have a lot of people that read, they come prepared with written statements, and they read it and give it to the whole board. I mean, is that,
Have you seen those written statements before?
not before they come up, they
Okay.
hand them to us when they come up, and then they read them
Okay.
to us.
That's, I guess it's a little more difficult to tell them that they can't read it because you're getting it for the first time. I mainly in this comment am referring to when they've submitted a letter in opposition and it's been in your packet, and then they want to take your time by reading it again to
That
stop
helps.
them right away.
Okay.
And say, you know, your letter's in the packet, we've read it, it's been provided, we've read it, you don't have to read it, we have it.
Each have a copy.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then you can, if you've got a lot of those, you can save yourself a lot of time in the process.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so that was making a good process by controlling public participation. How about controlling each other? You know, you're all not guilty of this, but let's say that someday you get a road board member that comes in. Oh, we have to figure out what to do about that, because that can be equally uncomfortable, can it, when you have someone who, like my narcissistic mayor example, you have to be part of the decision-making process with, and what are your options for dealing with them. And this is not a Robert's Rules of Order presentation, but I got some information in there as well. Do you have Robert's Rules of Order? Have you adopted them as?
We've not adopted them, but we do try to follow them.
Which is probably what most counties do. Just because you haven't formally adopted one doesn't mean that you can't try to follow them. So Robert's Rules of Order are designed to create order for the process and for the governing body as well. So, you know, there's a process. I'm not going to go over all of this on page 13 and page 14, but if you're a Robert's Rules of Order person, where some say where angels fear to tread, you can go through that and understand how the process for motions and what types of motions exist, and how a chair, really, the chair is the one that kind of is the presiding officer to control the procedure by reference to Robert's Rules of Order. So you can
Can you go over D number 2? I don't think we ever used this one.
let's see, where D2.
On page 15.
Okay.
That wouldn't be
Okay.
a chair, that would be individual members?
Correct, yep. You can move to limit debate. I've never seen this particular one, but I kind of throw this in as a mechanism from having worked with Robert's Rules of Order. But if you have a board member who you think wants to spend forever on a particular matter, you can move to limit the period of time in which debate occurs, so you can control the amount of time that's spent on it. That's a 2/3 vote. So that's a vote that can be done. Some of the other things, let's see.
You have the rule of 2 in here? I think.
The rule of 2,
Yes.
which one are you talking
No,
about?
question, do you have it in there?
As in a second person needs to, you need a second to a motion before you consider it?
No, excuse me, where you're speaking to an issue or motion where you can't speak more than 2 times unless everyone else speaks.
That's my rule, is Roger's rule of order, not
Oh,
Robert's.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I asked
No
you,
relation.
that is a bona fide thing.
Just a phoneme of
I don't have experience with that, but that doesn't mean you can't have that as a rule.
Okay.
Again, Robert's rules are commonly followed, but you have the right to have your own procedures.
It's a good rule.
And would that procedure have to be like part of the policy?
If you have rules, you should probably have written rules. So if that is a rule you intend to enforce, I think it's good to have that in writing somewhere.
Yeah. That tends to be a problem because our board members change and get new elections and stuff. And so what I've come across is when I talk about rules that we've talked about for conducting business, I've been told, look, I didn't.
Yeah. Do you have bylaws?
We're working on it.
We're working on
First
that.
things first.
That's what we're working on.
We've been working on it for 4 years.
We do for the planning commission.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ooh.
Tim is ahead of the game always. But that's where you could tuck in your anti-texting rule as well, if you're working on the bylaws, have an electronic communication component to it as well. So that can be in there. Moving on to 15 and 16, I'm going to kind of circle back to some of the procedural things that can be used, but how do we deal with difficult board members? We can have, if you're working on the bylaws as well, why not have a bylaw that says that board and commission members, when they engage in conversations, it has to be germane to agenda items or matters that relate to public business. So, someone that wants to go off on a total tangent, if they're a total rogue board member, that we have the ability to control them too. Personal attacks, the same thing. We have the ability through our bylaws that apply to us. We have the ability to have rules. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Why should we have one standard for the public, but not a different standard for us? So if you're looking at retooling any rules that you have for public participation, consider adopting the same rules for you as long as you're working on your bylaws that govern your own particular conduct. That way, if you have a board member that says, well, I didn't buy into that, well, you didn't have to. There are bylaws, they can apply to you. And you can control a board member in the same way you can control a member of the public. On page 16, this kind of goes back to the comment made earlier, the debate motion as well. You can use procedurally a motion under Robert's rules to close debate. So that's basically, I'm getting tired of this conversation, so I just want to end it because that board member is going on and on. So technically, you move to move the previous question, so that as you have a motion and a second on the floor, sometimes people say, I call the question, you ever heard of that? That's a motion, technically a motion that says, I'm tired of all this debate, I just want to vote on this. That's a motion that can be made. It's a 2/3 vote motion to close the discussion. So that's another vehicle, kind of like the 2 times rule might be to get to the end where you can finally make a board member who won't stop talking about an issue or making things difficult, bring it to an end.
Can the chair just do that without a motion?
No, you need a motion. As long as someone keeps on wanting to talk about the issue, there needs to be a motion on the table to just end the discussion and call the vote. You can refer to a committee as well as another tactical tool to be able to get it done.
I mean, short of that, saying, calling the question, I mean, you can just effectively say, okay, Greg talks a lot, you can't shut him up. You say, Greg, I think we understand your position, and he's quiet for 5 minutes.
You can do that.
I mean,
You can try that. You can try without rules. You can try counsel Greg into ending comment. But my discussion is premised on the notion that those attempts have been unsuccessful.
yeah, okay.
So these are tactical, procedural ways to be able to force the end of the discussion when you have someone who just won't be quiet at a board level.
And those are more effective to say, I heard you and I understand your point. It's very different to be
Nobody
just
stands
told
up.
you're done talking.
Then a motion to reconsider, just to be aware of how that works, because that's also, going back to my narcissistic mayor example, about I was wanting to go back and revisit things that have already been done as well. So just kind of remember that you hear motions to reconsider, but technically a motion to reconsider can only be made by someone who voted in favor of the matter. And the intent of that is to assure that that dissenter, the rogue board member, doesn't just get a right to keep on bringing it up and up and up again. Now, tactically, sometimes they do that. They vote in the majority if they're really smart, and the majority just so that they can continue to make your life miserable, but knowing it's going to pass anyways. But a second layer of safeguard to that is in the rules of procedure, it says that motions to reconsider have to be at the same meeting. So there's another layer of protection, and at least after that meeting, you'll be done with that as well. So just some technical things about.
Does the motion to reconsider have to be seconded by the person who seconded the first motion?
No.
Okay.
No.
Can be
No,
seconded by
it just
anyone?
critically needs to be made by someone who was on the winning side of that initial motion as well.
And it
Does it
does
have to
need
be
to be
during-
seconded.
Does it need to be during the same meeting?
Yes, it has to be at the same meeting, yeah. Technically, it's under Robert's Rules of Order. If you want to revisit something, it doesn't mean you can never revisit something, but it would be a motion to rescind a prior action taken.
And the motion to rescind, does that have to be made by the original person who made the motion?
I don't think so, but I'm not certain. I have to look at the
It has to
rules.
be by.
I don't carry those around with me intentionally. I prefer not to. But yeah, I'm sure the rules say, but I just don't remember. I
There's
think
something
you're-
that has to be by the same people.
So consequences. So now let's take it one step further. Now you've got all these rules in place and you have a difficult board member and nothing just seems to work. So what, aside, you haven't been able to conform their behavior, so what can happen? I just lay out some, if they're violating the open meeting law, as I mentioned earlier, that can be a personal responsibility of theirs, a fine that they would have to pay. If they're violating the Data Practices Act, there's potential personal liability, so we can counsel them on that regard. The county attorney's office can counsel them that you're exposing not only the county but yourself to liability, so you should be concerned about that. You have to stop doing these things. In a real extreme case, disorderly conduct, you have a total road board member that's acting dangerously, and call the sheriff to come and figure out what to do about it there. Another option is to counsel them and remind them of their fiduciary obligation. And this is more just out of common law, but much like you, in the employment arena, you progressively discipline employees. It's good to be able to document that you had a discussion with the board member of all the behavior that they engaged in that was contrary to their fiduciary obligations or exposed the county to potential liability, and that's for the reason I'll talk about in just a second. We can, on page 19 under 5, we can, if you've heard of censure, we can censure a member. Well, censure is kind of a slap on the wrist. You've been a bad person, and we want everybody in the community to know you're a bad person. But that's about all the teeth it has. You can disavow their action, which is kind of the same type of thing as censure. You're just a terrible person for all these reasons, and we want everybody in the county to know that. You can ask them to resign. A board, and I take the position of commission member too, can be removed from office for, the Constitution says, malfeasance or nonfeasance. And it doesn't define that, so we have to decide if a particular instance or conduct is malfeasance or nonfeasance in office, and that's kind of tying back to if there's a history of problems, to be able to document all this and document that you sat down with them and discussed this, and they still didn't conform their behavior, I think is good evidence to have if you're moving forward on that process. It's strange, and we represent school districts and cities too, and there is a specific statute for school districts that says for malfeasance and nonfeasance, here's the process that you follow to remove a board member, but only for school districts, not for counties and cities. So there's no process in state law for how we would handle this. So we'd have to make it up, and I've never done that. Never had to remove a board member, but if you ever got to that point where you said, this is too much, we're gonna move forward with trying to get this board member off the board, we have to figure out what that process looked like and demonstrate that we thought it was malfeasance and nonfeasance.
So do you have to have a policy to guide you in what a problem is considered? Because different people have different interpretations of what a problem is.
Well, it kind of goes back again to if you have the political will and feel it's necessary to pursue removal of a board member, you ought to be able to have a good case, don't you think? Because that's a huge thing. It's kind of like we've been watching on TV at a federal level, which basically is the same, high crimes and misdemeanors, malfeasance and nonfeasance at a local level. So we better have a good case going forward, which in my judgment means that we've had standards for behavior that have been understood and have been conveyed, and we've had opportunities for remediation that have been rebuffed. And we've gotten to that point. Because ultimately, you need to convince a court of that fact if it's challenged.
This is, the malfeasance and nonfeasance is the same for all elected officials. It's
Correct.
that same statute section.
Yep.
So this board has done that before with the former county attorney.
Oh,
It's found
okay.
to have malfeasance and removed.
Okay.
And I think
I should have probably thought about that, but I didn't. So you're one of the limited counties that have had experience.
Yeah.
It
That was
doesn't
a
happen
pretty
very
extreme
often.
case.
We try not to
You had
think
good
about it,
facts.
too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah, so I am,
And it wasn't challenged.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, good point, yeah, so.
A few times.
Sometimes you have stronger cases, in a case of a board member just being a pain in the butt. Obviously, that's a different case than you had previously, so you just have to assess every case. Is what this board member did in this case malfeasance or nonfeasance?
So being a pain in the butt isn't malfeasance.
It's up to-
Yeah. There have been very few cases. Another case, no. I don't want to go into that.
All right.
You just think you have bad board members too. You look at some of the cases that are out there. Some of us.
Okay, I'm a little bit behind schedule, but this part is, second part of it is, I think, a little bit quicker. So now we talked about all of those processes, how to have good processes, what to be aware of, what kind of rules that you might want to adopt, how you enforce them, both against the public and yourselves. So let's talk about good decisions. How do you make decisions in the land use area that, if they're challenged in court, are most likely to be upheld by a court? Well, the first part of making good decisions is to assure, and a lot of this is incumbent on staff too, to guide you through the process. But the first part is to make sure that you have a good record. Because as you think about it, variance decisions are challenged in district court. So here you have your local judge who is a member of the community and might know a little bit about contentious issues. But conditional use permit decisions are challenged by what's called a writ of cert to the Court of Appeals in St. Paul. Clearly there, we're going to get a panel of 3 judges that know nothing about the case or the issue that's before them. So the only thing that judges typically will ever know about a dispute, or what a judge or a panel of judges will ever know about a dispute, depends on how good of a record you convey to them. And we as the county have the luxury of being able to create that record. So we have control of that process. So we can either educate the judge or judges very well, or we can educate them very poorly. And when a judge considers a challenge to a decision that we make in the land use arena, they're going to ask 2 questions. One is, was there at least one legally sufficient reason for that decision? And second, are there facts in the record that support that reason? So dealing with the second part first, you can see the importance of the record. Because that's the universe of facts that the judge has available to him or her to say, yeah, that was a legally sufficient reason, and here's some facts that that board or commission relied on in making that decision. I'm not going to mess with that at all. So we can have great legally sufficient reasons, but we can lose the case because we have no facts in the record to support those particular reasons. So that's the importance of the record, and what the record is from the moment of the application all the way through the decision, every essentially piece of paper that's been generated that is germane to the decision. So it's the application, it's all the materials that the applicant submitted, it's if it involves a lake and the local DNR hydrologist weighs in, it's all the information you get from third parties that are pertinent to the issue. It's all the information you get from residents that submit materials either beforehand or come with that big stack of materials we talked about. It's the recordings of your proceedings, the minutes, if you have an audio, if you have video, they're reduced to something in the nature of a transcript. All of that stuff is the record. Do you have site visits at all on issues? So do you document the site visits? Do you create minutes of the site visits?
We don't do the site visits altogether, so individual members will go out.
All right.
And there was a period in time in which the board chair would kind of ask who has gone out and seen it. And a lot of times now we're to the point where individual members will just say, okay, I have visited the site in terms of when they're asked for their comments. But we haven't expressly documented the site visits.
The record is not what's in your head unless it comes out of your head. So we can't cut your head off and send it off to the court and have your thoughts
Not yet.
taken on.
I would.
That's why my point is, it's important when you go to a site visit, for example, your personal knowledge, your observations have to be shared with the group as a whole. They have to be reduced to tangible physical form. Make it in the minutes, or somehow, if those are important facts. So you went out there to a site, let's say you're a board member, and you went out to a site and you looked at where they wanted to cite a particular addition to a cabin or something like that, and you noticed a physical feature or ravine or something like that that influenced how you would look at it. Well, you have to share that with other people, don't you? If it's never shared, it doesn't exist. But we want a record of that if that's going to be a basis for the decision. I can't rely on that unless there's a fact in the record that talks about, well, board member so-and-so, in the minutes it says board member so-and-so went out and looked at the site on this day and shared this information with the other board members, so on and so
If you
forth.
speak it, if you orally report during the meeting what you observed at the site visit and it's a recorded
Yep.
meeting.
Orally is okay as long as it's reduced to tangible form, so we can transmit it.
Typically, I try to visit every site. I very seldom don't see it. And I will in the meeting say, I did visit that site today or yesterday, and this seems reasonable, the vegetation's there. At least some, probably 2 sentences, literally, but to reflect that.
No, just kind of.
There's no notes, nothing.
So carrying that a step further, there's actually even a case that involved the city of St. Paul where a decision was overturned because a board member came into some information that was important to an application in the standards court, but didn't share it with other board members. So one could even argue you have an obligation when you have information that you come upon to say, here's some information that I have. And I've kind of found too from smaller communities, especially when you have longtime residents on boards and commissions, there's just a wealth of institutional knowledge that can be germane. That person really needs to be encouraged. You have to tell us about this. Because there's nothing better than when you're talking about a particular issue and a board member says, yeah, I remember back in 1957, or was it 58, that we put that road in, and this was the case back then. Wow, that's important.
Jay, I was kind of commented earlier about notes or commissioners' notes if they are of public information or anything like that. What would you suggest in terms of, would it be beneficial or non-beneficial? We've never collected notes from planning commission members or anything like that to throw into the record. Would you even suggest that?
Yeah, well, I've never had to cross that bridge, and I could certainly see cases where I wouldn't want to include them in the record. Again, technically, is the record is the information that has been provided to the board as part of the decision-making process. And I would argue that if individual notes, weren't shared with the board, so why is that part of the record?
So we have topics come to the planning commission, goes through the process. The planning commission approves a permit unanimously. Then before it comes to the county board for final approval, the citizens that are opposed talk to county commissioners, and the county commissioners then vote against it. Does their reasoning for voting against it need to be part of the record? Because sometimes they just say no.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second in findings, but whenever we make a decision, don't you think it's good for us to have reasons for it? In particular, in the land use area, if we deny a request, courts say when we grant a request, it's assumed that we have determined that the standards for the permit or whatever have been met. I still think it's good practice to have findings when you grant something, but especially when you deny something, the board has to have findings. Particularly where your planning commission, as your example, has unanimously recommended approval.
Mhm.
So in your example, what are the board's findings going to be?
And
how does that help Tim when all of a sudden at a board meeting?
They felt it didn't fit the neighborhood.
Okay, all right. So, the county board isn't obligated to always follow the planning commission's recommendation, but if you're gonna go a different direction, then it's incumbent on the board and probably with Tim's assistance to say, okay, we need to develop some alternate findings here then, because the planning commission recommended this. Now you wanna go a different direction. Maybe even have to table it to be able to develop those findings.
Yeah, because often the county commissioners have different training
Yeah.
for planning, and they don't have the study of the land use
Yeah.
side.
Does the planning, or does the board get all the information that the planning commission
They
gets?
do, and they get phone calls.
Yeah.
And sometimes
Because I
based
wondered
on those
about that,
phone
because
calls.
you go through the hearing and listen to what the comments are, and then it goes to the county board, who haven't sat through that.
Mhm.
Yeah, they get the packets that you got, and then they have the additional write-up of a summary of the planning commission.
And then either Bill or Tim is there, or myself, to answer any further questions.
Right.
But we have had a situation where the neighbors contacted commissioners with their reason for why it should be approved, and the commissioners agreed with the neighbors.
Mhm.
Yeah, but the planning commission is only making a recommendation on the information that it's been provided with. When we make that recommendation onto the county may get additional information, and that may be resolved to change the decision. And that's why there's no obligation there, but we can only give you what we get, and that may not be the complete record.
Well, the calls that I got on this specific item, those people were at the planning commission, and the comments made at the planning commission were identical to the comments they made when they called me.
Well, let me play the devil's advocate based on your commenting too. Should that process happen? Should people be providing information to the county board that wasn't provided to the planning commission?
I could or shouldn't, what I'm saying is, is that as a planning commission, we try to get everything that we can. If that's not the complete record, there's not much we can do to change that. If there are people out there that have not come to us and want to go on to the county board, that's, that's the county board's decision to deal with that. We're simply a body that recommends.
Yeah.
It's circumventing the process if that.
Yeah, obviously people can circumvent.
That's the point I want to get to, and I'll try to answer my own question too. And we're mixing law and politics now, but there is a specific process set forth in state law and in your ordinance that you're supposed to follow when there is a CUP request, a variance request. And it's navigation.
You as a property owner are supposed to follow, is that?
Well,
what
the
you're saying?
county is, yeah, so there's a specific process, the county board's created the planning commission to be the advisory body, to hold the public hearings that state law requires, be held for these processes, to create the record. for the decision. So it's commonly, and this is where politics and law mix, county board members are and should be responsible to constituents. But is there an argument by letting people give them new information that was never part of your process, that is circumventing the process, that isn't how it's supposed to work? It's very common for county boards to allow people to speak at the county board meeting about a particular application. But on the other hand, couldn't you take the position, the public hearing's closed? What if these people want to submit new information that the planning commission never got? If I'm them, maybe I'm gonna sandbag, I think, what the planning commission's gonna recommend for approval, so I'm not gonna give them my best stuff. I'll just withhold things from them, and then I'll give the county board all my good stuff. And say, well, the planning commission was off base, they didn't even consider these things. Give it to them, but they didn't even consider these important facts. I'm gonna take my best shot with a county board, but is that how it's supposed to work?
I mean, we've had
You have
county
to decide.
commissioners visit the site after the planning commission had a hearing.
Some, do have some clients, city, counties, boards that have the political resolve to say, I'm sorry, we don't take additional information, or we don't even take additional comments. We've already had the public hearing. Because when you think about it, you also put yourself at risk, because now here, let's say it's the applicant who's sailed through planning commission, not a problem, it's their fault, but they don't attend the county board meeting because it's non-controversial and whatnot. But all of a sudden, the residents come in with a whole bunch of new stuff that the developer never got access to. Well, I've been deprived of due process. I never had a chance to be able to respond to that. The county board then just denied it. And I never got an opportunity to say, that's all BS stuff. So you run the risk too. So those are just decisions you'll have to make about how much more do you allow to happen at the county board after the closure of the public hearing.
And I will say that as a part of our process in bringing it through, we don't accept stuff in from any other person between the planning commission and the board of commissioners. As to, we can't control the board of commissioners as to what information they're receiving, but we don't include it in our packet that's going forth there. Many, many years ago, in a couple county attorneys ago, there was a practice of actually having 2 public hearings at the planning commission and then having a whole nother public hearing at the board of commissioners. And I had many people tell me they specifically did not come and participate at the planning commission, because why bother if the board of commissioners is gonna have their own public hearing? So I lobbied against that, and we got that changed. So yeah, it's up to the board. The board does get, the public to be able to provide them comment, but we don't, it doesn't come through us.
You're not elected, they are. And people feel they can exert their political pressure on elected people more than appointed people, which I understand. So what options do you have if that happens, aside from just going ahead and taking it off? What do you think you can do? Or rejecting it all?
You could reject it and table it. Or just
We sent
explain
it back to the
process.
plan, we have
There you
sent
go.
it back to the
Yeah.
planning commission for
That's
further.
another option, yeah. You could take, the approach that this is not proper for you to give us new information that wasn't given to the planning commission, they're our advisory body, send it back to the planning commission. And say, and don't do this again, by the way.
Can we say we don't want it?
You can.
Really good.
You did say that because the neighbors don't like it is not a reason. And what you're dealing with is the neighbors just don't want it.
Yeah, but who knows what the reasons were, maybe that's conveyed to the board
We
too.
could say some valid things and work the system.
But so there are
We all
means
know
of being
which
able
case I'm
to
talking.
avoid circumvention of the process, that you just have to decide how you're going to manage that when that happens.
Yeah, as much as, I'll speak for the planning commission, to say as much as we don't want difficult things to come back, I think that would be much better than just overruling it, because then we're kind of saying, well. what's the point?
Yeah.
Why undermine us, and if
Yeah.
we're gonna be there,
It's,
Yeah.
I think we're there for a purpose.
Yeah, you are there
Thank
for a
you.
purpose, and you have to make a recommendation. I actually had a case once, it was Mid-State County, where it was a contentious issue, this was the county board, and they were presented with it. And the decision of the county board was, we don't want to make a decision because this is too politically contentious. That was the decision. They lost on the 60-day rule thing, which probably was the goal of the county board anyway. They didn't want to make a decision, just let the court say, well, it's already granted by operation.
We need to prove it.
What I'm trying to point out is you have an obligation to make a recommendation or make a decision, so you have to figure out how to get there.
How about, how do you, if it's an issue that the commission, as the board doesn't fully understand the details of how you go about that decision? An example would be a water quality issue that Dawn or somebody goes out and observes something on a site and gives an information saying, I saw this issue on the site, but is Dawn qualified to even make that statement? But Dawn making that statement is
Then you
giving
can table
information
it
that-
for further review, and then the staff would go back out.
How about if it's something the staff's not familiar with?
You would table it.
To-
You
until
would table
when?
it at the planning commission until further review is done.
And for our resources, there are elements in which we don't, we're not trained engineers or anything like that with regard specifically to water quality, this or that. And so there are items, one of the most frequent elements that we've sent it to is to the SWCD to get their opinions on something, because they're set up for that. And then there are other times where it's been beyond the scope of the SWCD folks to be able to do, and then we request or require an engineer's report on something to back up whatever, the statements or concerns were from the planning commission.
And if those came in after you approved and then came to the county commission, it would be the same process. The county commission could table it.
Yeah.
Hold that thought, though, it's a good segue, because you are required to evaluate what we lawyers call the probative value of evidence all the time. I'll talk about that in just a couple minutes before we wrap up, but you'll have to decide if whoever is saying what they say knows what they're talking about or not. So hold that thought. I want to hit two more points before we wrap up and move and stay on the schedule. The next one is kind of the meat and potatoes of the decision. So we talked about the record. Now it's time to make a decision. And how do we make that decision? How do we make findings that are supportable and that reflect a good decision-making process? It's what I call it the why because approach. So we have to ask for any particular decision we're making, there's always standards that apply, in particular for permits like variances, there are standards in state law. Conditional use permit, there are standards in your ordinance. You're entitled to a permit if you can demonstrate A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. So you've got all these standards. So now it's just a question of taking the record. So all those facts, the whole land use process is designed as a fact generation process. It's all it is. From the application all the way through to the conclusion of the public hearing, all it is an exercise to amass facts. How many facts can we get that may or may not be germane to the standards? So we take all that record evidence, all those facts that have been given to us, as decision makers, we hold them up to the standards. Now the $10,000 question is, do they meet the standards or not? Yes or no? If they do, why do they meet the standards? And then we answer the question. That's the most critical part of it. We answer why we think they meet the standards or they don't meet the standards. And that's what a finding is. So a finding isn't, let's say that it's a variance case, and as you're familiar with those standards, will the variance request alter the essential character of the locality? Is the variance request reasonable? So on and so forth. If our finding is variance granted will not alter the essential character of the area, is that a finding? No, it isn't a finding. All it is a restatement of the standard. That's not a finding at all. It doesn't tell a court why you felt that that standard was satisfied. That's why you add to the end of it because. So the finding is will not alter the essential character of the locality because, and then we rely on all those facts, and we give our reason for why we think in that example, the essential character of the locality was not altered. So that really is the importance of findings. And let me just think of I'll give you a couple quick examples for lack of time that I usually spend more time on. But here was a variance request. Since we're talking about that, it was a variance request for a setback from the road right-of-way in a county, and it was in a very hilly area of the county. This property was just on over the crest of a particular hill, and they wanted to build a house very close to the road surface and to the right-of-way as well. So they sought that variance setback. Well, the county board, or that Board of Adjustment, was concerned about that, and they were concerned not just for these people, but because, at some point they'd sell the house. Some future owners, perhaps owners with kids, would have that house as well. And when this area got icy and they were traveling public was tooling down the road, they may come over the top of the crest and boom, there's a house right there. The roads are icy and they were worried about that. And in that county's comp plan, there was a little ditty that said that when making land use permit decisions, the safety of the traveling public and residents should always be considered. So they went through the whole process, variance denied. One of the standards for a variance is consistency with the comprehensive plan and goals and purposes of the zoning ordinance. So one of the findings, finding variance denied, variance request is not consistent with the comp plan and purposes of the zoning ordinance. Now, if there would have been a period there, would that have been a finding? No, right? That's just the standard. Variance not consistent with the purposes of the comp plan and the zoning ordinance because, and then add all the facts. The property is located in a hilly region. They wish to put the house closer to the traveling road surface. The evidence demonstrated that if a car came off the road due to icy conditions, that it could, run right into the front yard of this house where children in the future may be present. That doesn't meet that objective of the comp plan, period. So that's a finding. And through each of the elements, each of the substandards for the particular request you have, that's the exercise you go through. So you take all that information you were given, you apply it to these standards, you conclude yes or no on each of the substandards, add a because at the end, and fill in the blank. And that's what a finding is. And when you end up with those findings, then you make your decision most defensible. So that's how you make good decisions, is to end up with an end product that applies each and every substandard of that particular set of standards for the permit and then answers the because afterwards.
And if one of the findings is the icy road, but the other findings are okay?
For variances, you have to meet all the standards, and same for conditional use permits. So the courts say at least one, it doesn't have to be all the reasons, but at least one reason. So these are necessary, they're called necessary elements tests. So you have to meet all of them in order to qualify. You get a variance if it won't alter the essential character of the area, if it's consistent with the comp plan, if it's reasonable, so on and so forth. So it's not a weighing and balancing.
So one will do it.
Yeah, if you remember, I don't want to even raise this, but if you remember the Stadsvold test for a while, that was a court-made test on variances, that was a weighing and balancing thing that caused chaos for us. But that's gone, so forget I said that. So
I have a little question, hopefully we're not going too deep in the weeds here, but E1, it talks about, rejection of
which page?
21. Where a permit was denied based on fear speculation.
Another good segue, that's what I'm talking about now.
Yeah, and so in that example where children may be present in the future, this seems speculative and based on fear.
Well, no, speculative, it's fairly reasonable to believe that as properties are bought and sold, when variances are good forever, that there will be a point in time when children may be at the house. That's not totally speculative, is it? That's a fair deduction.
I'd agree. I was just, you know.
Yeah.
If I'm building industrial warehouses, I would be residential ones.
Yeah, let's talk about fear and speculation and our day on that. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was just your capacity as decision makers and how you view evidence, because this whole record, have you ever been involved in a case where person X says one thing and person Y says another? And then you have to decide, who do I believe? It's kind of like a murder trial where a jury hears evidence. One person gets up and says, I saw Jim pull the trigger and kill that guy. Another guy says, I saw Joe pull the trigger and kill that guy. Well, what does a jury have to do? Decide who to believe. Do we believe Joe pulled the trigger or the other guy pulled the trigger? The same exact thing is true in the land use context. So as decision makers, you will often be presented with evidence sometime that conflicts. And you have the ability, and right under law, to be able to weigh the evidence and decide who to believe. And the best example of that are the cases that I talk about down at the bottom of page 21 and on to page 22, where there are a series of cases where when a decision-making body has been presented with expert evidence, they have chosen to believe non-expert evidence, and the courts have upheld their decisions. So a couple examples. One case I represented, this was Wright County, I think it's cited in here. Consortium of cities wanted to put in a water treatment plant and discharge the water overland to the North Fork of the Crow River. And wanted to discharge it across some properties, and they had this really thick expert hydrologist's report that said it wasn't going to be a problem. But in the hearing, all these residents got up, including those who would be affected by the discharge, and a number of the people that testified provided testimony like, I farmed that land for 40 years. My dad farmed it, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. I know every inch of that land. I know how the water flows. I know that this is going to be a problem for my fields. And they had a bunch of that testimony, and the board denied the permit request. It was challenged, and the court sustained the denial and said the board had the right to be able to decide that these people were more credible than the experts. So that says a lot. That says that we have a lot of discretion to be able to decide credibility. But then going to speculation now, and the need for that to be concrete. So had those neighbors got up and just said, I oppose the CUP, what would that have done? Nothing, right? I'm just opposed to it, without that detailed information they provided. So whenever we get information, it has to be concrete and not speculative. So here's an example of speculative and concreteness. Have you ever had someone get up and say, this is going to destroy my property value? What's the question you want to ask them? How do you know that? Yeah, how do you know that? So that would be an example of assessing the probative value of evidence and giving it weight or not based on the credibility of that person. So let's say that's just the scenario that this person, when you say, how do you know that? They say, well, I don't know, I just know.
In our situation, that person is actually a realtor.
Okay, that's my second example. So now let's say it's a realtor. Is that more credible to you? What do you think?
Depends.
How about if they had the wherewithal to go hire an appraiser who did an appraisal? What if that
Was your
appraisal,
cousin?
what if it was, I saw this in feedlots and now I'm seeing it in solar projects. What if it's a general appraisal from out of state that is a study of whether solar projects have negative or positive effects on property values? Do you see any problems with that? We saw that in feedlots where these studies that were done, some in North Carolina and in other places, about what the effects of feedlots were on property values were flying around the internet. And they'd always show up at hearings on large feedlots. The opponents would always introduce these studies from North Carolina, and then the feedlot operators would introduce studies from other places saying feedlots enhanced values of properties. So we'd have those things. What do you think about that? The problem I have in that, for example, is how do we know if
Deer
this
feeding.
feedlot
That's the
will
biggest issue
devalue
around here.
this property? We just don't know. That's a generalized study. So, if it's just an appraiser, someone that says, well, I think that mining operations have a negative effect on property values. Well, that doesn't say maybe what you need to know. But if they had an appraisal done saying, I've appraised the effect of this proposed mine on this property, and here's my conclusion, that has some value. Then it's no longer as speculative, is it? And they have a basis to do that. So that's kind of going to that issue of what's the value of this evidence? And it kind of goes back to the earlier comment too about, is it someone saying something that they don't really have the training or expertise to be able to say? And is that something one can rely on?
Doesn't it come down to the measurability of something? I mean, if you're gonna make some speculation about it, you ought to be able to have some measurements to apply as a standard. If you don't have those, you're speculating.
Well, I don't think it always has to be measurable, because sometimes things aren't completely quantitative or measurable. But whoever is offering the information needs to have the credibility and capacity to be able to offer you that judgment. If it's the neighbor who's got no training on property value saying, well, this is going to devalue my property. That's the prime example that you see when people say that all the time, but you really say, how do you know that?
Well, we've heard that recently,
Yeah.
11 cars a day more, and
You will always hear it,
property is
yeah.
worthless.
Yeah.
So
So that's
glad
a
it wasn't
common
me that
example.
said that.
So just as you make good decisions, to recognize that it's okay for you to get competing information, but also recognize that you have the discretion to be able to weigh and balance the value and credibility of that information, and pick what you think supports the decision that you think that directs you to. But again, memorialize that. And when we talk about the findings of fact, that would be a good example of when you have competing information, where in your little mini finding, let's say it's a CUP, in our example about property values, you say would not decrease property values. Go on and recognize the conflicting information that you have, and then say why you concluded one way or the other. So in my example, it may be, we conclude that it will not decrease property values. Well, neighbor Jones offered testimony that in his opinion, this would reduce the value of the property. He didn't provide any other elaborating information. And in fact, the applicant provided this information to us, so on and so forth, that we deem to be credible.
Jay, question, to the extent that because we're a small community, we kind of know who people are, we know who the neighbors are, we know who the players are going to be. Say you have somebody saying that, has a proposal in, and then not just a neighbor, but a real estate agent who says, but they also happen to have a personal stake in the outcome, and they're providing information. We, in providing a report, don't want to put in, this realtor saying this, but we suspect there's ulterior motives because they have a stake in it. To what extent can that be considered on the planning commission?
Oh, it goes right to credibility, doesn't it? I mean, that's the essence of cross-examination. Whenever I cross-examine an expert on the other side, usually I don't try to battle them on the substantive grounds because they're the expert. I'm just a dumb attorney. I can't fight them on that level. They're smarter than me, but I try to call into question the credibility of their opinion for whatever reason I can. So anything that casts doubt on, they're saying this, but is there another reason Or do they have the capacity, or should I accept that as valuable or not? That's all fair game.
Yeah, there's income producing property.
In the report you're talking about, where you write what the realtor said or what the individual stated, you don't necessarily have to say they have a bias in this because of so-and-so. You can also state this person is an investor and does business or something like that.
Yeah, the bias is the conclusion. So you can offer the information to the board to allow that conclusion. Yeah, that's a good point.
I'll tell you a story in 30 seconds. 40 years ago.
Well, you only got 30 because I was
40
gonna
years,
be
40
done
years ago.
exactly at 12.
I was in Pine County working 40 years ago, and they were building a major power line, the big power line going down out of Canada through Pine County. At the same time, if you remember Stearns County, about 40 years ago, they were building that power line there, and people were cutting down, the farmers were going down, cutting down towers. If you're anybody old enough to remember that, Jenny, me.
Thank you.
They were cutting down towers over there because they did not want that thing near them. We gotta get rid of it. It's gonna kill our property values. In Pine County, the line coming through here, the farmers were fighting about, you got 2 towers and I only got 1. They wanted more towers because they got paid by the plot for each tower that came across. You know, so whose property value is, you know, same time that was happening in both cases. They're arguing, fighting, before who gets what.
Yeah.
Property
Academies in the world.
Location.
Well, I appreciate your time. I wanted to get you out on time, and we accomplished that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Very helpful, especially as we go forward with the bylaws.
You bet.
I'm sure it's beneficial for all of us.
One thing I wanted to ask of the group, just from my takeaway of this, is the why is so important, that if we could ask the public to, when they give their opinion, to ask for the why, I think that would be very helpful and valuable, both on the planning commission and the county board.
Or the county board just says the public hearing is closed.
Yeah, I meant in general, you know, the why is sort of.
You can be surprised. I mean, you say someone might come in and say, I think this is going to cause water quality problems, and then be prepared to go sit down. And if you say why, I'd say, oh, I've got some reports here that I got from a prior owner that show that.
Yeah, I got a folder in my bag right now of someone that has the why answer.
I didn't say that in the meeting. Maybe,
Yeah, we are.
you know what, I'm not elected, and I don't probably should.